Mute, it would be good.
Yeah, I'm gonna mute. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Perfect. Okay, we are today's daf is Rosh Hashana daf Chof Tes, and we are beginning on the bottom of daf Chof Ches Amud Sheni. Amalei Rab Zera l'Shamai. Okay, Rab Zera said to his attendant. Okay, it seems that Iza Maroim had an attendant together, and he said, Rab Zera, this is on shofar. Rab Zera could not blow the shofar. We go to daf Chof Tes Amud Aleph. He didn't, I don't know, he didn't have the koyach to blow the shofar. So he had his attendant blow the shofar on his behalf, and he would listen in. So he told him, ikavein, have in mind, concentrate that you're trying to help me fulfill my obligation in hearing the shofar. Okay? Try, in other words, try to be moitzi me. Okay? Have me in mind when you blow the shofar, and then utkali in blow for me. So Alma, so what do we see from that story? Kasavar, the opinion of Rabbi Zera is Mashmia, the one that's blowing the shofar, causing other people to hear the sound of the shofar. Boye Kavana, he has to concentrate who he's trying to fulfill the obligation for. He has to know exactly who he's fulfilling the obligation, who's listening in. Okay, even if he himself is trying to fulfill, the blower is trying to fulfill his own obligation, but if he's trying to help somebody else fulfill the obligation of blowing the shofar, of listening to the sounds of the shofar, he has to have that person in mind. So the Gemara asks, Meisvei, I'll ask you a question from a brisa. A man is walking behind a shul, okay, right? And of course, the shul windows are opened. If he's lucky, his house is next to the shul, right? He opens his window and he can hear what's going on in the shul. V'shama, and he listens in and he hears the kol shofar, the sound of the shofar, or kol Megillah, or the sound of the person, the chazan reading the Megillah. So that's it. He's not even in shul. In kivan liboy, if he has focused his heart to concentrate to listen to the sounds of the shofar or the sounds of the reading of the Megillah, Yotza, he fulfilled his obligation. Vimlav, if he did not, Lo Yotza, he was not fulfilled his obligation. If he didn't have in mind that he wants to fulfill his obligation, then he's not Yotza. So the Gemara asks the question, V'chikiven liba my have. Just because you concentrate and listen in, so what's the big deal for that? Louis, we just started. We're on Daf Chof Tes Amud Aleph, about 5 lines from the top. Chof Tes Amud Aleph. The question is, you just made a statement. We just started. We're on 5 lines from the top of Chof Tes. You just made a statement that the blower of the shofar has to know who he's blowing for, correct? And that was the opinion of Rab Zera. But this brisa says that even if you're not in shul, and you're just listening in, you're walking behind the shul, your house is next to the shul, so the guy that's blowing the shofar in the shul doesn't know you exist because he didn't see you in the crowd. And nevertheless, if you hear the shofar through the open windows of the shul, you're yoitza, you fulfilled your obligation, right? But just because you concentrate to try to fulfill your obligation, my hava, so be it. The person blowing is not thinking about you, and therefore you're not fulfilling your obligation. So answers the Gemara, Hacha, there with the case of the shul, b'shliach tzibur askina. We're talking about what? A chazan, a leader of the shul, the one that in charge of blowing. So the daite akule alma, his mind is always that whoever wants to listen to my sound of the shofar, I want him to fulfill the obligation. So even though he doesn't know that you're in shul, but he's having in mind that if you're going to listen in, you're going to be Yaitza. Okay? But what the case of Rab Zera is, and let's go, what would be the case of Rab Zera? Of a case like this. I hear a person blowing the shul, blowing for himself in his own house, correct? And he's my neighbor, and I listen in, and he doesn't know I'm listening in, and he had no intention to be mitzi somebody. So Rab Zera would say, that's not good. Because the Rab Zera told his attendant, blow, and have in mind, and have in mind when you blow, have me in mind. So that was the case of Rab Zera. Very different than the case of the shul. Hi, Alan. 2 lines from the 5 lines from the top, 7 lines from the top. Toshima, come in here. Niskavein shomea. The person who's listening in had concentration to fulfill the mitzvah. V'lo niskavein mashmiya. The person blowing the shofar had no intention to help somebody fulfill the mitzvah. Or niskavein mashmiya. The person who was blowing and had in mind people who was listening should be yaitz to the mitzvah. But v'lo niskavein shomea. The listener didn't pay attention or didn't have intention to fulfill the mitzvah. Lo yotze, it doesn't work. No one fulfilled the obligation. You weren't fulfilling the obligation. Ad, until shiskavein shomea umashmiya, that both the listener and the one that's blowing have in mind that somebody should be yotze with this blowing of the shofar. Okay, so the Gemara makes an inference. Ketani, if you read through, if you carefully read the Brisa, you can make a juxtaposition and say mashmiya, the blower, has to have the same thing in mind, dumya de shemeya, as the listener. Ma shemeya la'atzmai. Just like the listener, all he has to think about is that he himself wants to fulfill his obligation. Af mashmiya, so also the blower, mashmiya la'atzmai, has to have in mind that he is blowing for himself, right? Ukatani, and we say over there, this will be something ukatani yotza. In other words, that as long as the mashmiya, the blower, has in mind that he himself wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Tkiyah Shofar, even though he doesn't specifically have in mind the listener, that's the point. Even though he specifically doesn't have in mind the listener, he's blowing for himself. We see that this would be okay, because the shemeya is thinking about himself, and the blower is thinking about himself. He's not thinking about the listener, and it's still, and the Brisa says it's good. So this is a refutation against Rab Zera. Rab Zera told his attendant, "I want you specifically, when you blow, to have me in mind that I'm b'yotze the mitzvah." Who says that the blower has to have you in mind? The blower has to have a concentration that he himself should fulfill the mitzvah, but he doesn't have to have specifically in mind that the listener should fulfill the mitzvah. So who is Rab Zera going like? So the Gemara answers Tanoi. It's actually a machlokes Tanoi. The Tanya we learned in the Brisa, Shemeya, if the person's listening, he has to Shemeya la'atzmi. He has to have it in mind that he wants to be yotze the mitzvah. Umashmiya, the blower, what does he have to have in mind? Mashmiya lefi yadarka. He doesn't have to have anything in mind. He just has to know that he's blowing a mitzvah of shofar, and maybe he's blowing it for himself. So if somebody's listening in, even though the blower did not have that person in mind, you would be yotze. That would be the opinion of the Tanakama. But Rabbi Yosi, and this was the opinion of Rab Zera, Rabbi Yosi. He said, when do we say that you don't have to have this specific person in mind? Bishliach tzibur. That's talking about a chazan in shul, or the one reading the Megillah, because he doesn't have to go to every person sitting in the audience and say, I have you in mind, I have you in mind, I have you in mind. He could have a general view of the shul and have everybody in mind at the same time. But if it's a person blowing for himself, like I gave you the example, your neighbor is blowing the shofar, he doesn't know that you're listening in. So in that case, your neighbor didn't have you in mind. So there, you won't be yotze the mitzvah, even though you're thinking, I want to be yotze the mitzvah, it doesn't work. Until she's kavein shemeya umashmiya, until there's kavana, not only of the listener, but the one that's making you listen. In other words, the blower also has to have specifically that he wants you to listen, to be mitzi and fulfill your obligation with his blowing. Okay, so ended the sugya of concentration. A famous sugya in mitzvahs tzriches kavana, which means that's what the Gemara discussed previously, that when you perform a mitzvah, let's say you read the Shema at Marav. Before you read the Shema on Marav, very few people follow through on this, but you have to have pause for a second to think to yourself, right now, I'm going to fulfill a commandment that God commanded me to do. That's what it says. And if you see in the small print in the good Sudurim, it says pause and have in mind that you're going to fulfill the commandment, because we paskin that for the most part, mitzvah tzrichas kavana, that you have to have in mind that you're about to fulfill a commandment of God. And therefore, when you put on your tefillin, you have to pause for a moment before you put your tefillin on. And there's a whole prayer to say that I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin, or mitzvah of tzitzis. That's what we say mitzvah. But the Eved, we say, even if you didn't have in mind that you're fulfilling God's word, you're yotzei the mitzvah. But lechatchila, a person should have that in mind. So now that we talked about concentration, so the Mishnah goes off on a tangent, almost like an Agadita. The Mishnah says, it says in the Chumash that the Jews were at war against the Amalekim. And the Pasuk says, it came to pass, Kasha Yorim Moshe Yadai, when Moshe would raise his hand, the Gavar Yisrael, the Jewish people overpowered the Amalekim and were winning the war. So the Gemara asks, the Mishnah asks, can the hand of Moshe make wars, win wars, or break wars? What is the hand of the Moshe lifting his arm? What did that have to do with the Jews winning the war? So it's obvious that the wars are determined by other things. To teach you. And it was a significant point that Moshe's hand was a signpost that the Jews are united in doing what? Kozman Shah Yisrael, as long as the Jews, all the Jews fighting the war, mistaklin klape mala, in their mind's head, they were thinking that heaven runs the war. Their focus is that although they're fighting the war, but they have in mind that God is the one that's making it happen. U'mishabdin es libam la'avim shebashmayim. And they subserviate their heart to their Father in heaven. In other words, they accept whatever is going to happen. It's not enough to you want the outcome that you win the war, but there's another part to being Amunah, is that you accept whatever God wants it to be. So you subserviate your emotions to your Father in heaven. So when the Jews followed through on that, all of a sudden, they would win the war. Vim lav, when they were not doing that, then Moshe, tried to put his hand down, and that was a sign that the Jews need to be mechazik themselves, strengthen themselves. They would fall. So we see that focus in your head not only has to do with mitzvahs, but it has to do with winning the war. You see something similar in the Chumash again. The Chumash says when the Jews spoke against the man, Hashem sent in the desert very poisonous snakes, and the Jews who were bitten at that time died. So in order to save them, so Hashem said to Moshe, "Asay l'chos sarav, make for yourself a fiery snake, like made of copper. The sim oisoy al nes," and Hashem says, put that image of a fiery snake, of a poisonous snake, on a nace, which is a flagpole. V'hoya, and it will come to pass, kol hanashuch, anybody who is bitten by a snake, v'ra oisoy, he would stare at that snake, that copper snake, v'choy, and he would live. And that's the symbol of a hospital. Now, that's what it says. Now, the Gemara understands. Can looking at the snake bring about death if you don't look at the snake? Or if you do look at the snake, you're going to live? Ella, it has to do with your concentration and focus. And this was a signpost to remind you to focus your mind correctly and emotions correctly. When they would focus their logic towards heaven, that they know that heaven decides who's going to get healed and who's not going to get healed. And subserviate their hearts to the Father in heaven, that whatever that is going to happen is done rachmanis. They know their Father is running, doing the best for them. So if you had all that put together within you, you were healed. If not, you were affected by the bite. So that ends the Agadita part of the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah continues. Cheresh shoyta v'katan. A cheresh is somebody who is deaf, but here usually cheresh in the Mishnayos means somebody who can't hear and speak. Here he can speak but cannot hear. So that's this person. Shoyta, or somebody who is somewhat insane. V'katan, or somebody who's under bar mitzvah. So ein moitziin es yarabim yedei chavasan. They can't help anybody fulfill the obligation. They cannot be leaders of blowing the shofar. Zeh haklal. This is the general rule. Kol she'ena mechuyev b'davar. If anybody who's not obligated himself in this mitzvah, eini moitzias rabim yidei chavasa, cannot be the leader to help other people fulfill the obligation. And since a cherish, because he can't hear, is somebody that is not obligated in the mitzvah of shofar, so he cannot be the shofar blower. And the same thing with a katan, or somebody who's under bar mitzvah. Taner Rabbanan, or somebody who's insane. Taner Rabbanan, hakol chayovim b'tchiyah shofar. Every Jew has to listen to the shofar. Kahanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. Kahanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. You would think, what's the chiddush? A kohen Levi Yisrael, Gerim, a convert, va'avadim b'shcharim, a goyish slave that was freed, he becomes like a ger, right? So if he had a Kanaani slave, so then if you freed him, he now has to take on the obligation of the 613 mitzvahs. Then we said, v'tumtim, somebody who has a cover over his genital parts, so you can't really determine if he's a male or a female. V'androgynous is somebody born with both parts, a male and a female part. So that's those two types of people. Someone who is a half a slave and a half a free person. Now, how's that possible? You're half a slave and a half a free person. So the slave was owned by two people, and one of them freed. He said, I free my half. So he is a half a slave and a half a free person. Says the Brisa like this. The Brisa now goes into detail. Tumtum, someone who has his genital parts covered. You don't know if he's male or female. Eine moitzi, he cannot blow the shofar. Loyas minai, to be moitzi, somebody who's like another tumtum. V'loyas eine mina, or somebody who's not a tumtum, even a regular male, because we always think that maybe he's female and the person he's being moitzi is a male, so that wouldn't work. Because tumtum is like, you don't know. He's 50-50. Is he male or female? Androgynous could be, he could be both. He could be somebody who has an XY chromosome. So he could be both. So Moitzi Esmina, he could blow for other androgynous, Avaloi Eshem Einamina, but not for somebody who's not his type. Like he can't blow for a male or a female, but he can blow for another androgynous. I once read there's a famous surgeon in I think his name is Harvey Hendon, and they used to call him Hardly Human, a very famous surgeon. He operated a lot on these type of impossible operations to, open up these people so they can have normal appearances. Anyway, Misha Chetzia Eved v'Chetzia Ben Chorim, somebody who's a half a slave and a half a free person. He cannot be a leader and blow the shofar, not for another person who's a half an Eved and a half a Ben Chayrim, and not for a total Eved, somebody who's not his type. So now we go explain all this brisa. Amamar, we learned before. Everybody's obligated to blow the shofar. Kahanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. A Kohen, a Levi, Yisrael, they're obligated for shofar. So Gemara says, Pshita, of course, every Jew has to listen to the shofar. What's the chiddush to tell me that a Kohen and a Levi I have to hear the shofar? So the Gemara says, "Ihani loy mechayve man mechayve." If Kahanim, Levim, Yisrael are not obligated to hear shofar, who's supposed to hear the shofar? Chinese? What do you mean? So the Gemara says, no. Kahanim itzrachalei. The novelty is to tell you that a Kohen has to listen to the shofar. Because saltuk daite chamina, I would have thought hoyel eksiv, since it says yoim trua yir lechem, the pasuk says it's a day of blowing the shofar. Man de lese elabetchia adchad yoima hu de mechayve. The one who only hears the shofar one time a year, that person is obligated to hear the shofar. A regular Jew only hears the shofar on Rosh Hashana, so that person has an obligation to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana because it's the first time all year he's hearing the shofar. But the Kahanim, when they work in the Beis Hamikdash, they were constantly blowing the shofar. They were constantly blowing trumpets. By every carbon, it says you should blow trumpets. So since they hear blowing throughout the year in the Beis Hamikdash, trumpet blowing, the ksiv, it says in the pasuk, whenever they brought the communal karbana sacrifices, they blew trumpets. So so we're not going to obligate them to hear the Rosh Hashanah shofar because they're hearing trumpet sounds all year. Kamash malam. So the chiddush is of the brisa that they also have to go to shul on Rosh Hashanah to hear the sound of the shofar. So the Gemara asks the question, Midami, how could you compare? Hasam, what they're hearing over there, what they're hearing all year round is chatzoitzers, trumpets. Vahacha over here, shofar. It's a new obligation to hear it from a shofar, which is different than a trumpet. So why would I think they're not obligated to hear the sounds of the shofar? It doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, Ela itzrach, I still need it. There's a novelty to tell me that a Kohen is obligated to hear the shofar. Sal kedai techamina, I would have thought, Hoyel v'isnan, we learned in the Mishnah. The whole point that we know on Rosh Hashana that you have to blow with a ram's horn. How do you know you have to blow with an animal's horn? It really doesn't say so by any pasuk by Rosh Hashanah. It says it by Jubilee. It says when you blow by Yovel to free the slaves, you blow with a ram's horn. So therefore, we say there's a Gzera Shava that says Rosh Hashanah is like Yovel. So Shava, because Mishnah says Shava Yovel, Yovel is equal to Rosh Hashanah. That means whatever applies by Yovel applies by Rosh Hashanah, and the vice versa. The Tkiya to the what you blow and how you blow, a ram's horn that's turned, the brachas, and you also say the 9 brachas in Musaf. So I would have thought Kahanim really, certain halachas of Yovel don't apply to them. And so we'll say like this: Man de'iseh b'mitzvahs Yovel, whoever is obligated and every law of Yovel applies to them. That means every Jew, iseh b'mitzvahs Rosh Hashanah, he has to go to shul in Rosh Hashanah. V'hani kahanim, the kahanim, hoyel v'snai b'mitzvah de Yovel, since they don't have all the obligations of Yovel, don't apply to him. The Tanam we learned in the Mishnah, kahanim v'yim moicher la'olam v'ge'an la'olam. This is halacha that if you sell in Israel, if you sold your property, and if you consecrated, you have a property in Israel that really is your inheritance, and you donated it to the Beis Hamikdash, and the Beis Hamikdash sold the property to somebody else, you never get that property back. Even when normally you get the property back by Yovel. But if they sell it to somebody else, you don't get it back. Kohanim have this, always can get their property back. They're not determined with Yovel. They don't have to wait to Yovel to get their property back. They could always redeem it. And even if they miss the Yovel deadline, they still can redeem it even after 60, 70 years. So really Yovel in certain mitzvahs, and same thing with a house in a walled area, the halacha is that a Kohen could always redeem his house and he never loses it just because Yovel passed. So Kohanim, mitzvahs of Yovel don't apply to them. So Ema, I would have think the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, concerning the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, loy lechayve, they shouldn't be obligated. Kamash Mulam, that even a Kohen is obligated in the mitzvah of listening to shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Then Mishnah said, the Brisa said, if you're half an Eved or a half a free, then you're not fulfilling your obligation. You can't fulfill your obligation. Amar Rav Nahuna, ula'atzmoi moitze. A Chetzi Eved and a Chetzi Ben Choirim could blow for himself. No problem blowing for yourself. You just can't make anybody else fulfill the obligation, but you could blow for yourself. So now let's examine that idea. Amalei Rav Nachman Rav Huna. Rav Nachman said to Rav Huna, "Ma'ishno la'acherim." Why can't a half an Eved and half a Ben Chorim be moitzi somebody else, the loy, or anybody? Because part of him is a slave. The loy also tzad avdus, the part of him, the 50% part of him that is a slave, cannot help a mapik tzad cheres, help somebody who's a free person fulfill the obligation of the part of him that's free. In other words, if you're half a free person, you have to hear the shofar from a total free person, because that's the idea. You're hearing it from somebody who's totally free, and that's going to be moitzi, the part of you that's a half a free person. But if you're hearing it from another half of Evan and half of Ben Chorim, then you're basically hearing the shofar from a half a free person, and therefore you're not yoytze the mitzvah. That's why Chatzi Evan and Chatzi Ben Chorim cannot blow for somebody else. So therefore, so it says Rav Huna, la'atzmei namei loy also avdis techeres today umapet tzad cheres today. For himself, he can't blow because he himself is a half a free person and a half a Eved. So when he blows, what you're hearing is a half a shofar, basically, a half a sound, a half a free sound. So that half a free sound, how is it going to help his part that's a free person that has to hear it from 100% free person? Elo Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said, Af la'atzmo eni yoytze. He cannot even blow for himself. So it's a very tricky question. it's a good riddle to ask somebody. How is it possible that somebody is obligated to hear the shofar, and yet he can never blow for himself? He's not allowed to hear it from himself. So the answer is this case. Tanya Nami Hochi. Somebody is a half a slave, and half a free person. He can't be moitzi himself, but he could hear it from other people, from another 100% free person. The Gemara continues. Tana Ahava, new Gemara. Tana Ahava Berei Reb Zera. Kol habracha is kulan. Any bracha that you need to fulfill. Afal pisha yotza moitzi. Even though you fulfill the obligation, you can be moitzi others. So, for example, if you learned the Megillah and you heard the Megillah, you could actually make the bracha for somebody else, because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. That means every Jew is responsible for another Jew. And even though I was fulfilled my obligation of listening to the Megillah, blowing the shofar, if you didn't, I can make the bracha on your behalf. Okay? I can be moitzi you in the bracha. Chutz mi birchas alechem mi birchas yaim. I can't be moitzi you to make the hamoitzi for you, or make a bar priya gofen on your behalf, because that's not a mitzvah. If I didn't make hamotzi myself, then moitzi, then I can help you fulfill the obligation. So that means, like you have on every Shabbos meal, that you sit down and the head of the house makes the hamotzi for everybody else, because he himself didn't make hamotzi. But in Yotza, if he already made the hamotzi, or he already made the bar priya gofen, he can't help somebody else fulfill the obligation. The other person has to fulfill the obligation. Because here you don't say, Kol Yisrael, a raven, I'm responsible for you. It's not a mitzvah. I really don't have to eat. So therefore, you have to make the bracha by yourself. Boya Rava. So Rava asked the question. We go to Amud Beis. Birkas halekam shel matzah, birkas hayayin shel kiddush hayom. Sometimes a birkas hanehenin, a bracha on food, comes together with the mitzvah, like the bracha of you make hamotzi when you're eating matzah on Pesach night, ubirkas hayayin or bar priya gofen of regular kiddush. Maho, that case. In other words, let's say I made kiddush Friday night, and somebody walks into my house and doesn't know how to read. So I say to him, I made kiddush already. I'm going to make you kiddush again. I am going to make a bar priya gofen. Maybe, but since that bar priya gofen is connected with the mitzvah of kiddush, maybe I could be moitzi that person. Maho, Kaven the choiva, since it's an obligation, so it's like a mitzvah. So you say, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, and I could be moitzi him. Or Dilma, or maybe bracha lav choiva. If you look at the bracha itself, the bracha bar priya gofen, that's not an obligated bracha, obligation bracha. The kiddush bracha, asher kishon b'sois v'ratzavonu, is an obligated bracha. The bar priya gofen is not. So therefore, I wouldn't be moitzi him. So what's the din? By kiddush, Tanshama, the Ravashi says, Ki avina be Rapapi, when I was in the yeshiva Rapapi, have a mekadesh lam, and he would make kiddush, and then we started our Friday night meal. V'chiavi asari say midavra. Somehow he had workers come in from the field late Friday night, and they came to eat by him. So have mekadesh lahu. He made kiddush again for those people. They were still working, and he started his meal, didn't wait for them. But when they showed up again, he made kiddush again. So we see from here that you could make kiddush again. Tana Rabbanan la yifras adam prusa la'archen ela im kein oichel umahim. A person should not make a moitzi for guests, only if you're eating with them. In other words, if you invite somebody for supper, so then you're not permitted to be moitzi them the hamotzi unless you're eating also with them. Aval parisi lebanav levnei beisai kedei l'chamfim mitzvahs. If you have your kids eating, so then even though you're not making the hamotzi, you're allowed to make the hamotzi and they to be yaitza. If they don't know how to make a bracha, let's say you have a 4-year-old, he can't read Hebrew and he doesn't know how to make a bracha, and you don't want to eat the bread, you're allowed to make a moitzi on his behalf, and it's not a bracha levatala, simply because there's a mitzvah also to train your kid to make brachas, so that's permitted. Uva Hallel, Uva Megillah, and by Hallel and Megillah, which is mitzvahs, okay, Afal Pishiyotza, which is our discussion, even though you fulfill your obligation, moitzi, you can help somebody else fulfill the obligation. It's not a bracha levatala, again, with the same idea of Kol Yisrael, a raven zelazeh, and therefore I could remake the bracha. Hadar and Allah, Ru'u Bezin. We finished, now we're up to the final chapter of Rosh Hashana. We'll finish here. Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashana Shecholias B'Shabbos. The Yom Tov of Rosh Hashana that falls out on Shabbos. Ba Migdash Hoya Toikim. In the Beis Hamikdash they would blow. In the Beis Hamikdash, they would blow. In the Sanhedrin, and that's the point. The Sanhedrin had an office. The 70 people had an office in the Beis Hamikdash, and there they would blow by the Beis Hamikdash, and nowhere else. Avaloi b'Medina, not in the outside, not even in the countries. In other words, not even in Jerusalem did they blow the shofar. And the reason is because when Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, there's a gzeira not to blow the shofar on Shabbos, and we'll see about that in the Gemara. Why is there a gzeira not to blow the shofar on Shabbos? Now, I want to just interrupt. During the second Beis Hamikdash, the Sanhedrin moved their offices from the Beis Hamikdash, and they moved it out of the Beis Hamikdash to Har HaBayis. And the reason they did that is because there was so much rampant murders going on in Jerusalem. They didn't want to adjudicate capital punishments and killing people, so they just moved it out of the Beis Hamikdash into Har HaBayis, and therefore they're in the wrong place. So therefore they can make a sign that no more we adjudicate capital cases. But when they moved there to Har HaBayis, during that period, when Rosh Hashanah fell out on Shabbos, they would blow not only by the Bezdin of 70, but every place in Jerusalem blew the shofar. Whether you were in Bezdin, if you had a little shul somewhere in Rechavia, you blew the shofar. Mishachar Beis, now that I just spoke out that in-between state, and we'll get back to that. Mishachar Beis Hamikdash, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Hiskan Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, she'etoikim b'chol mokum sheyesh boi Bezdin. That wherever there's a Bezdin, only wherever there's a court and a court system in every city, that's when they blew the shofar. Again, you'll see why the reason is. But you probably know it by already, because when there is a bezdin, there's no concern that you're going to carry the shofar, because only in the bezdin they blew the shofar. Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that no, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, you didn't blow it wherever there's a bezdin, only where there was the 70 people of bezdin, and that it was in Yavna. The main Supreme Court was in Yavna. That's where they blew the shofar, but not in every city where there was a court. There was courts, they didn't blow it there. Amr Loi, but the Chacham said no. Echad Yavna, they blew it in Yavna. Ve'echad b'kol mokum sheyesh boi bezdin. Anywhere there was a court, that's where they blew the shofar. Now, during the time when again, as I spoke to you before, when the Bezdin moved out of the Beis Hamikdash and they relocated their office to Har HaBayis, to the Temple Mount, then every place in Jerusalem they would blow the shofar. Not only that, Jerusalem was even more than when they made it in Yavna. Again, when they were in Yavna, they only blew it in the courthouse in Yavna, nowhere else. In Jerusalem, they blew all around the city, whether you were a Bezdin, whether you were not a Bezdin, they blew all around the city. Not only that, any city that was so close that could see Jerusalem, hear Jerusalem, it means you could hear the sounds of Jerusalem. Ukroiva, and the city that was near Jerusalem was within 2,000 amos of Jerusalem. And therefore you could easily come there. There's highways to get there, roads to get there. Toikin, they would blow, even though that part was not called Jerusalem. Maybe that was called Modi'in. But since it was so close to Jerusalem, when Rosh Hashanah came out on Shabbos, they would blow. Uba Yavna, but after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, Loi Hoya Toikin, they never blew the shofar. Ela bebezdin, only with bezdin, and only in front of bezdin bavad. So the Gemara says, "Menohani mili." How do I know when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, you don't blow the shofar? So the Gemara says, "Amar Levi balachma, Amar Chomer b'chanina, ksiv echad oimer." One pasuk says, "Shabbosoin." You should stop working. Zichrin trua. Only think about the blowing. Think about the blowing. And v'ksiv echad oimer. And one pasuk when it discusses Rosh Hashanah, Yom trua yilachem. It's a day of blowing. So how do you resolve that? So loy kasha, it's not difficult. Kan b'yontev shcholius b'Shabbos. If Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, then don't blow. Just think about the blowing. Kan, when it says to blow, is b'yontev shcholius b'chol. When yontev falls out in the weekday. So it seems that it's a Torah obligation not to blow the shofar when it falls out on Shabbos. So the obvious question is Rava's question. Amar Rava, if the Torah says not to blow, if the Torah says not to blow, ba'migdash heichet tekina, how would they blow in the Beis Hamikdash? If the Torah says don't blow when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, Why would they blow in the Beis Hamikdash? So the Va'oid, Halav Malachi, and what's the whole point of not blowing? It's what wrong are you doing blowing a shofar on Shabbos? The Yitzrach Klar Lamute, where the Torah says, "Oh, it's Shabbos, don't blow the shofar." What's wrong? I mean, what malacha are you doing? The Tana Rabbi Shmuel taught, "Kol malachas avoid lo yisas." The Torah says, "Don't work on Shabbos or don't work on Yom Tiv." Yotzes atchiyah shofar, blowing the shofar, is not a work. Uredias apas, or removing the breads, which is a certain skill. If you watch it online, how they remove breads that was pasted on the side of the walls of the ancient oven. So those are skill, shu chachma. That's a skill. Ve'enu malacha. That's not considered work. So if you did that on Shabbos, you didn't do anything technically wrong. So what is wrong with blowing the shofar on Shabbos? Elama Rava says, midiraisa shir shari. I agree with you. From the Torah's viewpoint, it's permitted. But Rabbanu hu degzir bei der Rabba. Rabbanu made a rule according to Rabbah. Dama Rabbah taught. Hakol chayav b'tkiyah shofar. Everybody is obligated to hear the shofar. Ve'en hakol b'kiyim b'tkiyah shofar. Not everybody knows how to blow the shofar. So, and the way those shofars were made, they make shofars now. You pick it up; it's easy to blow. I mean, the technology in the making of a shofar is tremendous. But in ancient times, it wasn't easy. So everybody needed a teacher to teach you how to blow. So we have a gzeira, a concern. Shema, if we allow people to blow the shofar on Shabbos, Shema yitlena biyodei, a person will take the shofar in his hand. The yelech etzabaki lilmoid, he'll go next to an expert to try to teach him how to blow the shofar on Shabbos. The yavirenu dala amas b'rishus rabbim, and he'll carry 4 amas in the rishus rabbim. Certainly, if he took it out of his house, he might remember, oh, I'm not supposed to carry in the street. But even if he's in the street and he forgot and lifts the shofar up and starts walking 8 amas in the public domain, so then he'll forget. So that's the reason why we don't blow shofar on Shabbos. The Megillah. That's the reason of Lulav, and that's the reason of Megillah. And therefore, in the Beis Hamikdash, we don't make Gezeres to Rabbanan. That's why in the Beis Hamikdash, they used to blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash in front of Bezdin. And anywhere there's Bezdin, they had their own minyan probably, and they blew the shofar there, because technically, Min HaTorah, you're supposed to blow the shofar, but since they're the court, they're certainly not going to make the mistake to carry the shofar, and probably there are experts there. And that's why it didn't apply where there was a Bezdin. Okay, so we'll stop over here by the first wide line on Chavtes Amud Beis.
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody get a good night rest.
A gute Nacht.
Gute Nacht.
Gute Nacht.